Hello, my name is Peter Tatara. I'm the Director of Film, Culture, and Community here at Japan Society. I'm honored to welcome you to this, Japan Society's Japanese Literature Night. Japan Society is in New York City, the publishing capital of the world. And over the past few months, we've begun a focused season of author events to help spotlight the world of Japanese literature. And tonight is the centerpiece of this series. Before we begin, I'd like to thank tonight's sponsors. Tonight is only possible because of the generous support of a grant from the Toshiba International Foundation and Yen Press. And I want to additionally thank Kinokuniya Bookstore, Columbia University Press, Media Do, and Symphony Space for all their time and effort to bring tonight to life. If we can, give them all a round of applause. So now, what is tonight? Tonight is an event with 3 parts. We will begin with a live recording of selected shorts. Produced by NYC's own Symphony Space, selected shorts is broadcast on over 100 radio stations around the country, and it transports audiences through the magic of fiction as read by leading actors from across stage and screen. Tonight, selected shorts will record a very special episode focused on Japanese short stories here at Japan Society, read by Rita Wolf, Maria Dizia, and Hugh Dancy, each bringing a tremendous Japanese story to life. Here I pause and say, silence your cell phones. We're going to take a moment, you're going to look at your phones, make sure they're silenced. It is okay to take photos of the event, but no flash, and please no video. So one more beat as I make sure you've all silenced your phones. We don't want to make this awkward. Thank you. Immediately following selected shorts, we're honored to welcome Keiichiro Hirano to the stage. Hirano is a prestigious author from Japan who has won the Akutagawa Prize for his debut novel at only the age of 23. Now, over 15 books later, that debut book, Eclipse, is finally coming out in the US thanks to Columbia University Press. He's here to speak at Japan Society about his past and the world of Japanese fiction. Following his speech, there'll be a brief Q&A. Then lastly, following Hirano-san's appearance, you're all welcome to join us in the lobby for a reception with beverages generously donated by Itoen, Brooklyn Kura, and Brooklyn Brewery. Yes, yeah, oh, I thought this was a classy crowd, but suddenly the free beer. During the reception, I also encourage you to visit Kinokuniya's pop-up bookstore for copies of Eclipse already signed by Hirano-san. If you enjoy tonight, I encourage you to come back. We still have more literature events this season with 2 more author signings, one later this month and one in December. If you enjoy tonight, I also encourage you to become a member. Members help us in our mission of bringing the US and Japan closer together. Members also receive discounts on all of our events and invites to exclusive member-only events. And that's about all I have before I introduce the host of Selected Shorts. I'm going to briefly pause again as I see more people have arrived and remind everyone to silence their cell phones. That's right, silence your cell phones. Photos are A-okay, but no video during the event.
Up next, I'm proud to introduce award-winning author Keiichiro Hirano. Mr. Hirano won Japan's highest literary honor, the Akutagawa Prize, at the age of 23 for his debut novel, Eclipse. Since then, he's written more than 15 books that span history, love stories, short stories, essays, even science fiction. He's one of Japan's most thought-provoking authors, and I'm honored to welcome him to the stage for a talk and a Q&A. Please give a round of applause for Keiichiro Hirano.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Keiichiro Hirano. I'm truly honored to have been invited to speak at Japan Society Literary Night and to be here in front of such a distinguished audience. I've been looking forward to meeting all of you. First, let me express my gratitude to everyone who worked to make this talk possible, especially Japan Society, Toshiba International Foundation, Yen Press, New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council, and the Sandy Heck Lecture Fund. I'll be giving this talk in English. Since my English is not my strongest language, I prepared a manuscript from which I will be reading. Sorry. As was mentioned in the introduction, probably, the purpose of this talk is to provide an introduction to contemporary Japanese literature. However, it is nigh impossible for a single author to fairly and comprehensively cover the diverse range of literature out there. Therefore, I plan to present my own journey as a writer as one example of our contemporary literature. I will begin by illustrating the characteristics of the generation I belong to, known as the lost generation in Japan, and indicate how we differ from both the preceding and subsequent generations, with the aim of describing the generational milieu that Japanese writers have found themselves in since the 1990s. My theme will be the philosophical idea of personal identity. In other words, the question, what is the self? I was born in 1975 and belong to the generation sometimes known in Japan as the junior baby boomers, Dankai Junior. We are the children of the baby boomers, Dankai no Sedai in Japanese, the generation born en masse after World War II. Although the definition of the baby boomer juniors can vary somewhat, it technically refers to those born between 1971 and 74. While a separate term, post-junior boomers, is sometimes reserved for those born between 75 and 81. However, in terms of our generational experience, among other things, the two generations cannot be clearly delineated, so I will boldly refer to those born in the 1970s as junior baby boomers. This generation largely overlaps with what has been called the lost generation, or losugene in Japanese, for short. I'm from Kitakyushu, a heavy chemical industrial city in Fukuoka Prefecture, which makes up part of the island of Kyushu in the south of Japan. Japan's heavy manufacturing industry was inaugurated in Kitakyushu in 1901 with the establishment of the Yahata Steel Works. Using funds from the indemnity China was forced to pay after the first Sino-Japanese War. By the time I was a child in the 1980s, the city was in a state of serious decline under the metal manufacturing slump known as the metal chill-down. As a factory workers' town, Kitakyushu didn't have the most culturally inspiring atmosphere, and I was often taunted for attending piano lessons being called rich or girlish or something. Due to this environment, I didn't become much of a reader until elementary school. It's not that I dislike books, only that there were a lot of more enjoyable things to do. On sunny days, I was constitutionally incapable of sitting around at home and immersed myself outdoors in playing baseball or soccer or catching insects and crayfish. After the release of the Nintendo Entertainment System, I became engrossed in video games too, for a while. In a word, I was utterly ordinary 1980s boy from a provincial Japanese city. If there was anything that set me apart from all other children, it was that I had lost my father at a very young age. My parents began married life together in Aichi, located near the geographic center of Japan. Aichi. Aichi was the prefecture in which my father had been raised. My parents maintained a modest yet happy home for our family there. Then, at the age of 36, my father had suddenly stricken with a heart attack and died. I have no memories of him, being only 1 year old at that time. Now, at 49 years of age, I'm 13 years older than my father was at his time of death. That is a very strange feeling. After my father's death, my mother returned to her family home in Kitakyushu with me and my sister, who is 8 years older than 8 years my senior. And we began a new life with my grandparents. This was when I was 2 years old. My father's death was a formative experience for me as a novelist that holds several important meanings. For one thing, while I'm told that my father cared for me, I cannot remember any of it, and not for want of trying. This is unsurprising given my age at the time, but the result is that memory and forgetfulness have become major themes in my literature. I know my father in a sense, of course, but only through photographs, like the memorial portrait that adorns our family altar, and those words imparted to me by my mother, sister, and relatives. Photographs of my father were nearly as important to me as my father himself. Few exist, this being an era long before the ubiquity of digital cameras. These scarce remaining images stood as precious evidence through which I came to know him. So I could never bear, even now, to tear them up or throw them away, as much as I'm aware that photographs in regard to their material composition are nothing more than pieces of paper. My feeling of attachment to these photos has given me a strong interest in media theory. My latest novel, Heart of Hearts, yet to be translated into English, is the story of a young man who creates after the mother who raised him alone has died, a kind of AI-generated simulation of her, known as a virtual figure or VF. Simulating one's mother from beyond the grave might seem creepy from a common sense perspective, or to some even ethically wrong. However, humans have since time immemorial used media in an effort to keep the deceased in the world of the living. Initially, this was done with portraits and sculptures, later photographs, and then videos. It would be far from unusual, therefore, if the desire to recreate the dead emerged via the next progression of media, which will allow for interaction through VR. When newspapers initially began to serialize Heart of Hearts in daily installments in 2019, this premise was considered unrealistic, but the perception of readers shifted after companies in South Korea and China actually released products similar to the virtual figures I had imagined. In the United States, concerts featuring holograms of deceased musicians have also attracted many fans. The second means, in addition to photographs, by which I came to know of my father's existence, was words. I asked my mother countless times what sort of person he had been. I also asked her again and again why he had to die. My tone in this questioning was not necessarily serious. Children are not generally able to attain a solid grasp on the concept of death. But I was especially immune to feelings of loneliness or sadness due to his loss because I grew up in a household where, as far back as I can remember, his absence was the natural background to life, and where my grandparents, relatives, and family friends were extremely kind and sympathetic to me. Whenever I asked my mother about my father, she would regale me, describing his disposition and appearance and relating amusing anecdotes until I was satisfied. I would often pester her to tell the same stories about my father over and over again. My mother also did the best that words can allow to answer my unanswerable, somewhat philosophical question of why he had to die unexpectedly at such a young age. In retrospect, my mother's attitude at such times was akin to that of a novelist trying to convey the backstory of a protagonist to the reader. Just as I wanted to know everything about a father who I knew not at all, the reader strives to understand the protagonist from a condition of ignorance. This is why, when I became a novelist, I would describe the protagonist's personality and appearance and relate incidents concerning them chronologically, the way my mother described my father to me. The abstract questions about life and death that I encountered along the way, I would have to illustrate just as patiently as she had. What most struck me about my mother when she spoke of my father was that she was always brimming with love. Perhaps this is how authors should relate to their protagonists. Some novelists argue from a rather lofty perspective that literature is about self-expression, and that taking the reader into consideration is a kind of adulterated pandering. However, I had a potent experience of knowing my father through my mother's words and cannot forget the great consideration with which she spoke to me as a young child. As a result, I'm conscious of the reader when I write novels. However, this has nothing to do with compromise in a commercial sense. Another aspect of losing my father that made an impact on me was the specific way he dies. My father had been perfectly healthy, fit enough even to have served in his college days as the captain of the judo team. Then one day, his heart just stopped, and that was it. I found this exceedingly odd. In a vague sort of way, I began to believe that there were two types of death for human beings. One is the gradual kind that approaches over the course of, say, 80 or 90 years. The other is the sudden kind, arriving out of the blue due to accident, natural disasters, and murder, or illness, as in the case of my father. I thought that all of humanity could be roughly divided into these two categories of death. For me as a child, death in 80 years felt too remote to be concerning. The idea of sudden death, however, casted a disturbing pall of fear over me. My heart is beating now just like all of yours. But if for some reason the next beat were to falter, my life would end right there, just like my father's. Once I'd come to this realization, although I was an utterly ordinary boy, as I said earlier, a wave of anxiety began to come over me now and again when I was just having fun reading manga or playing video games with my friends. And I would think to myself, my heart could stop in the next moment and kill me. Should I really be reading manga right now? Shouldn't I find something I really want to do and do that? But when I thought about what I might be passionate about, I didn't have a clue. I felt that in order to find whatever it was, I would have to first know my true self. This merely shifted the problem to something about which I couldn't ever guess, and I remained at a complete loss. It was in this period that I began to read literature. Throughout elementary school, I sensed no inconsistency in school life. Once I started to ponder these issues, however, I began to feel increasingly out of place in the classroom. I was basically an outgoing kid and had many friends, but now when I hung out with them in a group and we were talking about the TV show we'd watched the previous day or manga that had come out that week, the conversation no longer interested me. Though on the surface, I acted as though I was having a good time. This is an experience that many people have to some degree in adolescence when the self is being formed. At that time, I never talked about it with my friends and believed that it was something special I was going through. This is when I picked up The Temple of the Golden Pavilion by Yukio Mishima on the lark and read it through. I have never been the same. The Temple of the Golden Pavilion is a novel narrated in monologue form by a young man who struggles to communicate with others due to a stutter and finds his only refuge in the beauty of Kyoto's Kinkaku Temple. The plot ultimately takes a dark turn when the protagonist sets fire to the temple as a personal means to go on living. But the prose positively sparkles and is rich in lush, poetic diction. I was riveted by the contrast between the loneliness of the young man and its aesthetic expression. I proceeded to read the other works of Mishima and numerous works by his influences, thereby fumbling for my own way as a reader of literature. I particularly enjoyed the early works of Thomas Mann for their depiction of the conflict between civil society and art, as well as the French symbolist poetry of authors like Baudelaire and Rimbaud, which beautifully express the rift between reality and the ideals. When I was reading literary works, I would sometimes come across passages that made me marvel at how well the author seemed to have understood my own mind. These moments were so viscerally intense that I felt almost like a different person than the one who tried to conform superficially with his schoolmates. Eventually, I began to believe that the me at school was not my true self, but just sort of a masked performance, while the me who was immersed in literature was my true self. In other words, a major split had opened up within me between the fake and the genuine article. The form taken by my questions about the nature of individuality, personhood, and the true self were influenced by the historical context of the day. By the time I reached middle school, the Ministry of Education has stipulated that education ought to emphasize individuality, and we were often told in the classroom to cherish who we are. This was consistent with the fictional domain of movies, soap operas, and mangas, where attractive people were invariably portrayed as those who fully realized their individuality and lived in accordance with their unique essence. Like my peers, I admired this approach to life and wholeheartedly agreed that it was important to be yourself. However, in actual practice, junior high schools in Japan provided a highly uniform education. Students were subject to the same curriculum from morning until night, wore the same uniforms, sported the same haircuts, and traveled to and from school at the same times, leaving little opportunity for individual expression. Consequently, communication skills were overly emphasized. Female authors of my generation frequently addressed in their writing the anxiety surrounding food to eat with at school and the fear of being left all alone during lunchtime. Though such issues were never a major concern for me, being a boy and one who ate his packed bento quickly. Progressing from high school to college, many students, myself included, began to organize their thoughts around the belief that being yourself meant making money doing what you love, which amounted essentially to finding a profession that matched your so-called true self. This approach is similar to that of the 5 levels of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, in which you identify your individuality and seek self-actualization through employment. It was extremely common in Japan, where a system of lifetime employment had long been in place, for people to enter a company in their 20s and continue at the same job for 40 years until retirement. This tendency held especially true for skilled professionals such as doctors and teachers. A person's occupation thus became central to their identity, which is why alignment with the true self had to be emphasized. I still have no idea what to do with myself. Japanese high school students intending to major in the natural sciences typically have specific plans for their careers by the time they take college entrance exams, aiming for the architecture department at a particular engineering school or the astrophysics department of some science faculty, and so on. Students planning to enter the social sciences or the humanities, on the other hand, tend to have much more vague ideas about their future. Being in love with literature and feeling that I was my true self when reading books, I had already begun to write fiction in high school. Still, for a student in a far-flung region of the country, the possibility that I would or even could become a novelist didn't seem even remotely realistic. So, what should I do after graduation? Struggle with the problem as I might, I hadn't the faintest. I had no intention of staying in Kitakyushu and seeing out the decline of my hometown. At the same time, I deeply loathed the superficial frenzy and the decadence of Tokyo in that period, bridging the late 1980s to the early 1990s, when Japan transitioned from the peak of the bubble economy to its collapse. As I mentioned earlier, I admired early Thomas Mann, and I emphasized with his protagonist who oscillated between civil society and art. However, there was something hollow about civil society in Japan. And when someone slipped into an identity crisis, they chose, rather than seek belonging in local communities, to accept an extreme choice, either assimilate into ruthless capitalism or live to the dimension of the nation and embrace nationalism. Neither an option appealed to me. In the end, I decided to go to the Faculty of Law at Kyoto University. It was a choice made out of uncertainty, packing myself off to an in-between place, neither Kitakyushu nor Tokyo, still unsure what I wanted to do. Looking back on that time still makes my chest ache. I appeared from the outside to be just a flunky student, but that was only because I was overwhelmed by my yearning and impatience to do something and become someone. I matriculated in 1994 after the economic bubble had burst, making the end of the high school economic growth period, a high economic growth period that had begun not long after World War II. On the global political level, the simple division of the world into the blocks of East and West had fallen apart with the end of the Cold War. While in Japan, surreal and horrific events such as the Great Hanshin earthquake and the Tokyo subway sarin attack perpetrated by the Om Shinrikyo cult came in quick succession. Meanwhile, the internet was only just beginning to emerge, and there was no escape from the confused and oppressive social atmosphere. With the nation of Japan itself losing direction, students could hardly be expected to envision a future for themselves. Possessing neither hopes nor dreams and clueless as to what to do in the future, my generation was perceived as a bunch of lamentable and pathetic babies. Much of the criticism came from our parents, inflated by pride at having realized Japan's economic miracle. Neoliberal economic reforms since the 1980s that has intensified social competition only made our predicament worse. My first novel, Eclipse, was written against this backdrop. I have taken an interest in those people of the late Middle Age in Europe who, watching many of their contemporaries die in pestilence and war, were captivated by the philosophy of Gnosticism, which posited that our world was the sinister creation of an evil deity. I was also fascinated by the alchemists who attempt through experimentation to create the philosopher's stone and transform base matter into gold, which was essentially an effort to assign value to the valueless material world. Then there are the fantastics who are sought to purify the world by eliminating evil through witch hunt and inquisitions, and the mystics who attempt to transcend the world by becoming one with the divine. I set the story of Eclipse in a small village in southern France, where various locations and events could converge to allow these moments to interweave. I wrote the novel between the age of 21 and 22. Problems with identity formation in Japan are certainly not unique to our generation. Soseki, a Meiji-era, late 19th to early 20th century novelist, considered to be one of Japan's greatest writers, grappled with similar concerns. In his lecture, My Individualism, Soseki reflects on his youth in this way. Having been born into the world, I had to find something to do. But what that something was, I had no idea. I stood paralyzed, alone and shut in by a fog. Soseki was born into a pre-modern feudal society of the Edo period. Japan was organized by a caste system in which occupation, whether samurai, merchant, artisan, or farmer, was determined by family status. Although recent historians have pointed out that there was in fact some degree of movement between these occupations, the people by and large lacked the freedom to choose their form of employment. A corollary of this, conversely, was that teenagers need not struggle with the problem of discovering their so-called true self, nor of finding a profession that matched their identity. A samurai child would be a samurai, and a merchant's child would be a merchant, and family lineage would remain the core of one's identity. As an aside, the samurai class comprised only about 7% of the population during this era. The majority of people were farmers. The spirit of Bushido began to be recognized among the entirety of the Japanese people only in Meiji era, especially after the First Sino-Japanese War of 1894. However, with the Industrial Revolution, the urban population swelled and new industries emerged one after the next. To efficiently supply young labor to meet the needs of society, occupational choice had to be liberalized, a change that was anathema to a rigid caste system. People were drawn naturally to vibrant and high-paying new industries society demanded, while the workforce in soon-to-be obsolete industries renowned away. In this way, automatic allocation of labor to positions best suited for skills became the idea from a society granted freedom of occupational choice. The process of filling positions was rarely so smooth in practice, but there was no alternative. In any case, the result was that individual identity shifted from caste to occupation. One might think that freedom of occupational choice would be a blessing for individuals, but as I alluded to earlier, it also amounted to a duty of occupational choice imposed by society on young people. This was required because society would instantly fall into dysfunction if young people failed to quickly discern their aptitudes and begin working in the necessary fields. So, even though youth should have been situated to enjoy freedom of occupational choice as a right, they suffered under societal pressure to exercise it early in life as a duty, leaving them to fret over the problem of discovering their true self. Similarly, the members of my generation would eventually determine their own individuality, however imperfectly, and attempt to enter the workforce upon graduating from college. The system whereby companies hire new graduates en masse is unique to Japan. Within the lifetime employment system remained rigidly in place. The pre-graduation job hunt was a significant turning point in life, due to the extreme difficulty of changing careers or of finding employment outside the regular hiring schedule. However, with the arrival of a severe recession following the bubble's collapse, companies drastically curtailed new graduate hiring, leading to a prolonged cool-off of lifetime employment known as the employment ice age. Since the population of us junior baby boomers was large, the Ministry of Education had established numerous universities in preparation, resulting in an exceedingly high university enrollment rate. The upshot was that an enormous number of new college graduates ended up fighting over a minuscule number of jobs. How did this turn out? Despite all those lessons on cherishing our individuality and all that incitement to realize our true selves through our careers, many in my generation failed to find a job and slipped into a serious identity crisis. Some asked what purpose they served in society or even wondered why they had been born. If our entire generation had been unable to find lifetime employment, a sense of generational solidarity might have emerged. But a select group succeeded at the job hunt, and the disparities arose depending on academic credentials. Graduates of prestigious universities were sometimes able to enter their first choice company, while others became regular employees in companies they didn't care for. The rest consisted largely of non-regular workers and those not in education, employment, and training, known more frequently as NEETs. The inequality within my generation was not fully manifest at first because regular employees started out in their 20s with a relatively low income, while non-regular employees might increase their workload and make a comparable income if they had the energy for it. However, after the 2008 Lehman shock triggered the global financial crisis, non-regular employees lost their jobs in droves, and others found themselves trapped in unskilled, low-wage labor even into their 30s and 40s. All the while, regular employees were receiving pay increases and promotions within their companies, getting married, and leading stable lives. However, although there was a range of different outcomes within my generation, we experienced a marked degree of poverty overall compared to the previous and subsequent generations due to the employment instability, which is why we are soon doubled the lost generation. One of the biggest factors behind Japan's current demographic crisis of rapidly declining birth rates and rapidly rising average age is inability of the lost generation to afford to marry and have children. Given our lack of savings, moreover, there are concerns that Japan's social security system will collapse when we reach retirement age. Sayaka Murata's Convenience Store Woman, the most internationally acclaimed novel by a Japanese author of this generation, cannot be properly understood without taking into account the history I have sketched. The perversion of searching for existential validation by becoming a cog in the capitalist machinery that the novel depicts only makes sense in this context. Being evaluated as useful can be genuinely satisfy our need for approval and make us happy when it comes from those close to us in face-and-face communication. We find joy in being useful to friends and lovers. However, When the source of evaluation is the state or the capitalist system, the notion of being useful can easily be converted into the negation of individualism or a corporate tool of exploitation. Such phenomena have been widely observed in Japan over the past 30 years. Even though the poverty of the lost generation was due to the sheer backlog of comprising a large population that was hurled onto the harsh labor market in the wake of the economic bubble, proponents of neoliberalism coldly chalked it all up to personal responsibility. The wealthy succeeded thanks to hard work in a brutally competitive capitalist society, while the poor were lazy and lacking in effort. This false explanation has been thoroughly debunked by Michael Sanders' The Tyranny of Merit, a book that has recently gained attention in Japan. As the current disparities have been reproduced across generations, it is deceptive to claim that they were the outcome of free competition between individuals. Japan still has a significant gender gap, with a significant wage inequality between men and women, and the personal responsibility argument serves to conceal such discrimination. Faith in meritocracy is not merely a product of the 90s, but has a long history in Japan, dating back to the Meiji period. Lifting oneself up through diligent effort was celebrated and institutionally enshrined through introduction of an examination system, because the Meiji Restoration, a revolutionary movement that brought about Japan's modernization, had been organized by lower-ranked samurai. The idea of meritocracy was crucial to the rejection of counter-reactionary movements in favor of the feudal caste system. One of the most important figures to promulgate meritocratic ideas was Yukichi Fukuzawa, an Enlightenment thinker of the Meiji period, whose portrait was long featured on the 10,000 yen bill. When in 1872, he published his essay on encouragement of learning, it became a bestseller, said to have been read by 1 in 10 of Fukuzawa's contemporaries. In it, Fukuzawa writes, people are born without distinction of rich and poor, noble and base. Only those who diligently pursue knowledge and understand things well become noble and wealthy, while uneducated become poor and base. Social Darwinism was imported to Japan in the early stages of its modernization process, and one of the most popular European thinkers of the Meiji era was Herbert Spencer. Nowadays, however, the close linkage between the singular essence of the true self and the single profession has begun to come apart, as the avenues for acceptance of identity have diversified due to the advent of the internet, the collapse of the lifetime employment system, and the promotion of both job mobility and secondary employment. It is not uncommon for activities on platforms like YouTube and TikTok that are separate from a person's primary job to support their social identity in the form of birth income and group approval. These are new loci for belonging distinct from capitalism, the state, and local communities. So far, I've been discussing general intergenerational differences that result from economic conditions. However, I should clarify that these differences do not neatly match up with the characteristics of authors from each of these generations. Ultimately, it seems that writers from every generation are propelled to immerse themselves in literature and initiate their creative projects out of the kind of social maladjustment. This is just as true of bubble generation writers who could easily secure jobs during those economic boom times, as it is of the generation of writers currently in their 20s who are also blessed with job opportunities due to declining birth rates. Looking further back to post-war Japan, there were writers like Yukio Mishima who could not fit in with the drive for rapid economic growth and fell into nihilism that they sought to overcome by writing novels as a form of aesthetic reality. I've always sympathized with Mishima's reaction against the economic fervor of bubble era Japan, but not with his choice of the emperor as the source of validation for his hollowed out identity. Nevertheless, I believe that the differences between generations of writers are reflected in the respective social eras from which they are isolated, and the elements of that era against which they rebel and with which they resonate. In my case, although I never had to find a job at any company because I began writing and became a professional novelist while I was still in college, I have a profound awareness of belonging to the lost generation. I can feel the weary eyes of society watching for the day we grow old. This has made me a staunch opponent of the personal responsibility argument, which is why in my novels I carefully depict the social context and avoid making the plot overly depend on the characters' personal traits. To craft the story otherwise would be to turn the fate of the characters into a matter of personal responsibility. The gap between rich and the poor is a problem of social structure and of the historical milieu. My intention is not to completely deny the virtue of individual effort. The point is that it is not everything. Now, regarding the question of selfhood that is my theme in this talk, I have considered its social significance by discussing its connection to occupational choice. Is the problem of the identity crisis that results from a breakdown in the close linkage between a person's job and their so-called true self unique to Japan? Or do young people here in America also face an analogous situation? In either case, the question of selfhood must be examined from the standpoint of communication. I have already emphasized that the members of my generation were instructed to live as individuals and be their authentic selves, and that we have simultaneously been expected to possess communication skills. These two demands may seem contradictory at first glance. The apparent contradiction can be resolved only if you become a different version of yourself, depending on your interlocutor. In this way, you acknowledge the diversity within society and can successfully communicate with those who have different backgrounds and personalities. The self must be internally diverse. Acting as though you are the same you everywhere will not lead to successful communication. On the contrary, it will turn your personality into something like a mass-produced product, applicable to everyone. Personality is a kind of pattern that arises from the interplay of communication with the other and increases with the number of others. However, the differentiation of personality depending on the interlocutor seems to contradict the notion of a single true self. The model that emerged as a makeshift solution was that while there is one true self, the ego, there are multiple social personas or roles, and that one lives by switching between these as needed. As a novelist, I have made the exploration of this problem a major theme in my work. The concept I have focused on is that of the individual. The term individual had to be translated into Japanese as kojin. Since Japan did not historically possess any corresponding concept. The word kojin came into common usage when European thought was imported extensively during our modernization period. For English speakers, it is probably obvious that individual is a combination of the negative prefix in and the word divide. However, it is nearly impossible to derive the meaning of indivisibility from the Japanese translation kojin. The term individual derives etymologically from the 6th century Latin individus, which was originally a translation of a Greek word atomos. Individus literally means that which cannot be divided. While I omit in this talk an explanation for how this word came to mean one person, a summary in Raymond Williams' Cures suggests that the process was influenced by the monotheistic Christianity as well as by logic and biology. In early modern Europe, as the hierarchical feudal system was dismantled and redesigned into a functionally differentiated modern civil and capitalist society, the individual, possessing an essential unity that could not be further divided, became the fundamental social unit. Individual self-ownership became the basis for ownership in general, while individuals became the entities bestowed fundamental human rights and suffrage, as well as the capacity to contract as workers within a functionally differentiated production and distribution system. During its modernization phase, Japan imported and changed this concept of the individual as a legal and economically contracting entity. In everyday human communication, by contrast, as I mentioned, each of us is forced to divide into a different personality for every person we interact with. It is simply impossible to maintain an indivisible subject. In the novel Anna Karenina, for example, Tolstoy adroitly depicts the variation in Anna's personality depending on whether she interacts with her husband Karenin, her lover Vronsky, her child Seryoza, and her brother Oblonsky. In his novel, Sanshiro so systematizes the split between the protagonist's personality in his hometown and the personality that arises in the process of his adaptation to life in the big city. Stories of youth dreaming of success as they move from the countryside to city in modern centralized societies, like those penned by Balzac and Stendhal, are of course staples of modern literature. While humans are considered indivisible subjects within a legal framework, they inevitably possess multiple faces in the realm of everyday social interactions. This has led to the adaptation of a Jungian model where there is one true self, the ego, that employs several superficial personas. This model of conceptualization, still deeply rooted today, has several shortcomings. One issue is that when we are communicating with others, we can't always distinguish our personas from our ego, nor can we always superficially manipulate or differentiately employ them. In our interpersonal relationships, we experience fluctuations in emotions such as joy, anger, sorrow, and pleasure that are invariably accompanied by physiological responses. But it is not as if we can control reactions like laughing, crying, sweating, or increased heart rate. Furthermore, if we designate the social self as entirely performative, then the true self must become merely an abstract entity utterly cut off from all social relations, which contradicts the fundamental truth that humans are social animals. Moreover, even when we are alone, our personality can vary significantly in accordance with our environment. For instance, someone's personality, both in terms of cognition and affect, will undergo a comprehensive change depending on whether they are homeless and sleeping outside in the cold, or drinking champagne alone in a luxury hotel suite, or holed up in a trench on the battlefield. Since humans are beings whose personalities are relatively two variables, their interpersonal relationships and external environment, I believe that any theoretical model that posits the true self as a fixed personality devoid of change is inappropriate. This is why I have devised a model where the true self is not a singular individual kernel surrounded by roles or personas directed towards society. Instead, in my model, we differentiate our personalities in accordance with each interpersonal relationship. And the true self is seen as the totality of differentiated personalities rather than as some singular core. In contrast to the individual, I call each of these differentiated personalities dividuals, which I translate as bunjin in Japanese. Dividuals do not exist in equal proportion to each other within us. If we were to visualize the self as a pie chart, the portion taken up by individuals that are significant to us would be large, while the portion taken up by individuals correlated to people we see only once every few years would be relatively small. For example, if the individual correlated to your work colleagues accounts for about 40%, then the individuals correlated to your old middle school classmates might be around 0.5%. These proportions ceaselessly change over time in accordance with each interpersonal relationship and the environment we confront. The capacity to decide who to associate with, what kind of environment to live in, and which composition and the proportion of individuals to embody is precisely what constitutes human freedom and responsibility. If we consider the composition and proportion of individuals as a person's individuality, then individuality becomes something that continuously and dynamically changes. In other words, rather than being fixed a priori, it is discovered posteriori through its consequences. The traditional concept of the individual emphasizes the consistency of an ego that cannot be internally divided. Conversely, it almost implies that a person can be crisply divided from the other. Individuals are independent entities divided from each other. In reality, however, we are constantly influenced by our external environment, remain open to others, and continue to be affected by others even when they are not around, while also affecting them in return. Therefore, the visual philosophy allows for internal differentiation of the self while establishing, by contrast, an indivisible communication circuit with the other. An important implication of this way of thinking is that multifarious influences from a variety of environments and others continuously mix within us, making it impossible to purify the subject. An advantage of this theory, as I mentioned earlier, is its capacity to respond flexibility to diversity in society. Furthermore, I believe it will be effective in overcoming social divisiveness. An economist, Amartya Sen, writes in Identity and Violence, "The illusion of singular identity, which serves the violent purpose of those who orchestrating such confrontation, is skillfully cultivated and fomented by the commanders of persecution and carnage. A falsely conceived singular identity, according to Sen, is what drives social division." His argument is that we need to recognize the plurality of identity and decide which of our diverse associations and affiliations to prioritize, rather than simplify discovering our identity. Our societies intensify conflict by linking the indivisible subject model of the individual to a single affiliation, be it Christian, Muslim, Asian, white, male, or female. Then, in an effort to unify these divisions, we struggle to find overarching values. Same points, however, it is that we should focus on the plurality of identity that each individual possesses and overcome divisions instead through a more finely balancing network of relationships. I fully agree with this position. Taking on board this way of thinking can prevent the reduction of occupational choice and identity to a simple one-to-one matching. As society becomes increasingly unstable, and opaque, we can dynamically stabilize our lives by perceiving ourselves in terms of multiple projects, and thereby realize a state where we have backup sources of income and alternative relationships in case any one of these fails. Furthermore, by making the objects of our self-awareness a plurality of individuals correlated with others rather than a monolithic, indivisible ego, both self-denial and self-affirmation can be converted from total affirmation or total denial to partial affirmation or partial denial directed at a particular individual. This is essentially important in Japan, where youth suicide has become a serious social issue. By observing and relativizing the specific individuals we like or dislike within ourselves, we can prevent ourselves from resorting to the means of complete self-denial that constitutes suicide. Conversely, self-affirmation rather than descending to narcissism can be predicted on gratitude for the existence of those others who give rise to our favorite individuals, opening up a path to self-affirmation mediated by the other. This is the foundation of my view of humanity that humanity and the mechanism behind my recent novels, including At the End of the Matinee and A Man. I would like to expand on this idea further, but unfortunately I do not have the time. I have covered a lot of ground in the short time, so allow me to conclude this talk here for now. If there are any questions or points of disagreement, please allow me to address them during the upcoming Q&A time. Thank you very much.
One more round of applause for Hirano-san. And one more for him presenting that in English. The reception will begin after I ask him 3 brief questions on the stage. And again, a thank you to Itoen, Brooklyn Kura, and Brooklyn Brewery for donating beverages for tonight. As a reminder as well, Kinokuniya Bookstore has a pop-up shop in our lobby. As part of that, they have copies of Hirano's books both in English and Japanese, especially pre-signed copies of Eclipse, all from Hirano-san. As we prepare the stage, I also want to remind you of some upcoming events. On November 21st, we have debut author Natalie Anna Jacobson here for her YA yokai fantasy, Ghost Train. On November 22nd, Ozu's final film will be presented here in 35mm an autumn afternoon. On December 5th and 6th, we are presenting 2 silent films with live Benshi narration, both Chishengura and Diary of Chuji's Travels. Then on December 11th, we're very excited to welcome Sonoko Sakai, an acclaimed cookbook author. Sakai will present her newest book, Wafu Cooking. If you go to our website as well, we have a copy of her, bless you, a copy of her miso apple pie recipe for you to enjoy just in time for Thanksgiving. And I believe we are just about ready. So thank you all again. I'm going to ask 3 brief questions, and then the reception shall begin. So please, another round of applause as we welcome Keiichiro Hirano back to our stage. So I'm very curious to ask, looking at contemporary Japanese fiction, what are the major trends that you see right now? What are the new trends you're seeing in Japan?
ちょっとここから日本語で喋ります。
I'm going to switch to Japanese now. Apologies.
まあ今日世代の話をしたんですが、まあ作家はそれぞれに非常に異なった関心を持って小説を書いているので、なかなか一言で言うのは難しいです。ただ一般的に僕よりも下の世代は日本が長い経済的な停滞に入ってから生まれた人たちなので、そのこと自体をある意味で当たり前と思ってるんですね。僕の世代、いわゆるロスジェネ世代というのは80年代ぐらいまでは日本が非常に好景気で、自分の未来もそうなると思っていたのに、深刻な不況が来たというそのギャップに非常に苦しんだ世代なんですが、僕より若い世代っていうのは最初から日本の経済状態が悪いというのが前提で、それがやっぱり一つ大きな価値観の違いになっていると思います。
So I spoke on generations during my talk just now as well, but as you know, each individual novelist and writer has different things that they're passionate about and different things that they're interested about. So it's really difficult, if not impossible, to just generalize them in one lump. However, if I may, those who are of the younger generation than I am, they were born in an era where Japan was already in economic decline. That's all they've known. Whereas my generation, the lost generation, we started off when Japan was still doing very economically successful, financially successful, and then all of a sudden, abruptly, the bubble burst, and we were plunged into economic decline. And it's that kind of sudden gap that created this loss of self, loss of identity, and I think really influenced our writing styles.
でもう一つはやっぱりテクノロジーの進歩というのは非常に早いので、例えば AI だとか、コミュニケーションのツールだとかそういうものがやっぱり小説にも大きく反映されてきているというのがこの10年ぐらいの一つの傾向かなと思います。
So I also think another trend is the pace of technological advances. Not just that there have been technological advances, but it's getting faster and faster. So whether it's AI, artificial intelligence, or the actual tools that we use to communicate, I think all of that is also reflected more and more in the current literature, and that certainly could be said to be a trend.
そういう意味では僕よりも上の世代と下の世代の間でその技術の進歩に対する感度といいますかそれをどういうふうに影響を受けるかということに関してはかなり大きなギャップがあるようにも見えます。
And so I think that I can confidently say that if you look at the generation older than mine and the generation that preceded me and the one that is subsequent, certainly how they react and adapt to these technological tools and how they are also then influenced by them, there's a very big difference, a very big gap.
Thank you. I think looking at individual authors, are there any Akutagawa Prize winners or nominees from the past few years that you think are especially remarkable and anyone that we should make note of here in the West?
芥川賞というのは日本で最も有名な賞の一つなんですが、これは新人の作家に与えられる賞なんですね。それで僕はこの5年ぐらいの間ずっとその選考員を行っています。でちなみに僕がデビューした時にもこの芥川賞という賞をもらいました。
So the Akutagawa Prize of Literature is probably one of the most famous and well-known such prizes in awards in Japan, but it's actually aimed and given to new authors, new novelists, and I've been on the deliberation committee for the last 5 years. But in fact, I also won this prestigious award when I debuted with Eclipse.
で最近の事例で言いますと、一番新しい受賞者の九段理恵という女性の作家は、そのオリンピックの時にザハ・ハディッドが国立競技場を新しく建てるという計画があったんですが、予算の問題なのでそれが実際には立たなかったんです。計画中止になって。しかしもしその建物が建っていたならという想像力に基づいた小説を書いていて、その中でその AI と建築家の女性が対話する場面を描いているんですが、その AI がしゃべる場面のためにチャット GPT で実際にチャット GPT に会話をさせてみて、それを使った場面があるんですね。でそのことが、AI の場面で AI の言葉を書いているので、問題のない使い方だとは思うんですが、受賞後彼女が AI で小説を書いたというふうな、間違った伝わり方をして、これが日本だけじゃなくて CNN なんかでも報じられるような非常に大きなニュースになりました。しかし、作品自体は別に AI が書いたわけじゃなくて、部分的な明らかな仕様だったので問題はないと思いますが、彼女は非常に才能豊かで、三島由紀夫だとか太宰治だとかいった過去の作家の作品を非常に巧みに自分の作品に取り入れながら、しかも新しい感性で作品を書いている優れた作家の一人だと思います。
So to give one specific example, in fact, the newest winner of the Akutagawa Show is a female novelist by the name of Rie Kudan. And so back when the Tokyo Olympics were originally being planned, there was an architect, Zaha Harid, who was supposed to design the main stadium for the Olympics. But unfortunately, due to budgetary issues, he ended up not being the final architect. But the premise of this of her story is, what if he had, in fact, his design had been actualized? Had been actualized. What would have happened? And so it part of the novel talks about how she a female architect, converses with AI, and for that particular scene of the conversation between the two, the author actually used ChatGPT to come up with the AI's side of the dialogue. And so if you ask me, I mean, the AI was used to create dialogue for the AI character, so I did not see any problem with that. But after she had won the award, it was actually reported with a incorrect nuance, where it sounded like she had written the whole novel using AI, and it became this big thing, and not just the Japanese news, but even abroad. I mean, it even was reported in CNN. But as I said, I mean, it was only a very small part of the novel, and in fact, it was AI used for AI. So, you know, I think it was a shame that this became such a big issue, and it was corrected. But I feel she's a very talented novelist. She definitely is very cognizant of, and perhaps even channels, Mishima and Osamu Dazai, and yet she also has her own unique take and perspective on matters as well.
それからあと2人ぐらい例を挙げたいんですが、その少し前に賞を受賞した市川沙央さんという女性は、自らご自身が背中の背骨が非常にカーブする難しい病気を抱えていて、その病気の当事者としての、当事者としての立場から小説を書いてるんですが、その女性の、中絶する権利をめぐってですね、彼女は中絶する権利を擁護したいのと同時に、自分が障害者であるがゆえに、もしかしたら自分はその権利のために生まれてくる前に堕胎されていたかもしれないという不安を抱えていて、その非常に難しい矛盾を巧みに書いた作品で評価されました。
And just slightly before that, there's another female author, Sao Ichikawa, who actually has a very severe disease where her back is completely, the curvature of the back is completely pathological. And so she writes from the perspective of being a person with disabilities. And, you know, she also writes about women's rights. But on the one hand of writing as a woman about women's rights, as being a person who has a physical disability, she also had that uncertainty and anxiety that what if she had perhaps been aborted as a fetus because of her disability. So she's also another brilliant novelist.
もう一人は男性の作家で遠野遥という作家なんですが、彼はその日本人が、あるいはこれ人間がと言ってもいいかもしれませんが、システムに完全に従属的に生きている姿を非常に皮肉を込めて、ちょっと不気味な文体で描くんですが、しかもそのいやいやシステムに従わされてるんじゃなくて、本人がむしろ進んで積極的にシステムの一部になりたがる様をですね、非常に気味悪く描き出していて、彼の作品も非常に評価されましたし、僕も今後が楽しみな作家だなと思っています。
So the final author that I'd like to give as an example is a male novelist named Tono Haruka, but he writes about an individual who is kind of living within the system, who lives immersed in the system, and you know, almost to the weird point where he's not actually resisting. It's not like he's being forced to conform, but he's actually proactively, deliberately immersing himself in the system, and he does it in a very kind of not sarcastic or negative way. And so I think, you know, he's very highly regarded, and I also I really look forward to seeing what works he puts out in the future.
一つだけちょっと付け加えると、これはいいことなのか良くないことなのかよくわからないんですが、日本ではクリエイティブライティングコースを経て作家になるというケースが非常に珍しいんですね。ほとんどの作家がクリエイティブライティングコースではないところで自分で小説を書き始めて作家デビューするということになってます。そういう意味では、完成度という意味ではもっと継続的に発展させなきゃいけない部分がある、あるいは欠点があるにしても、非常にある意味では個性的というか独創的な作品が生まれてきているということも確かです。ですからもちろんクリエイティブライティングコース出ていい作家もたくさんいると思うんですけど、なぜかそれがうまく機能してないというのが日本の作家にとって何か一つの特徴になっているような気はします。
And if I could add just one thing, whether this is good or bad, I'm not going to pass judgment, but just as a fact, it's actually really rare for a Japanese novelist to emerge having taken and then matriculated through a creative writing program. Most Japanese novelists just start writing on their own and end up managing to debut as a professional novelist. And, in terms of, is their writing style perfect or smooth? Perhaps there's a little bit of disadvantage of coming through that kind of system, or lack of system. But on the other hand, I think it also leads to the fact that you get very unique individual personalities shining through, and in a good way, very quirky novelists and their works. So I think that's something that's different perhaps about Japan and Japanese literature.
Thank you. Deeply appreciate those recommendations. I think for my last question tonight, I want to talk about you and Eclipse. You're here in New York in part to celebrate the release of your debut book, finally in English. That was when you were 23, a few years ago. So how do you feel you've changed as a writer since that 23-year-old to today?
講演中にも話しましたけど、90年代の日本というのは非常に閉塞感が強くて、その世界にもううんざりしつつ、その世界でやっぱり生きていかなきゃいけないという分裂した気持ちに突き動かされるようにして書いたのが「日食」という小説で、その後、しかしどうやってこの世界を生きていったらいいのかっていうようなことを20数年間自分なりに考えてきて、神秘主義や錬金術をメタファーとするのではない、もう少し現実的なアイディアなんかを考えながら小説を書き続けてきたので、今の自分はその頃と、根本的にはこの生きにくい世界をどう生きるのかっていう意味では変わってないんですけど、具体的なアイディアだとか考え方っていうのは、それなりに発展しているところがあるんじゃないかなと思います。ただ小説家は、自分にとっての最高の作品はいつも最新の作品だと言いたいところなんですが、じゃあ昔のものが悪いかっていうと、昔書いたものを読むとかえってなんかみずみずしい感性が感じられたりとかっていうのもあるので、必ずしもだんだん良くなっているというわけでもなく、だんだん悪くなっているわけでもないとは信じたいんですけども、そういう意味では今の自分とは非常に違った作品のような印象を受けます。
So I may have mentioned that, I believe I mentioned this a little bit in my talk as well, but Japan in the 1990s was rather closeted, and is kind of, I really felt stifled, and yet I was faced with the reality that this is the world I had to live in and live through. So the last 20 years, I've been continuously thinking about how do I survive in the reality of the world. And in some ways, Eclipse deals with alchemy, and where it's not to really use it as a metaphor, but I was trying to come up with more of a modern explanation or tool. So basically, the fundamental idea of trying to figure out how one survives in the world that they find themselves in, that part hasn't changed from when I was 23 to now. But in terms of the practical solutions, or practical tricks and theories that I have about how to do that has changed. To the point where I think I've definitely changed as a person, not just as a writer. And most writers will tell you, and I'm no different, that our best work is the one that we've finished most recently, and it's the most present one. And sometimes you go back but that's not necessarily that the earlier work or the debut work was bad necessarily. We could go back and read it and feel nostalgic about it and say, oh, that wasn't so bad. And I feel like it's just that it's just very different what I wrote then than what I'm writing now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That concludes tonight's Japanese Literature Night. A thank you again to Toshiba International Foundation, to Yen Press, Kinokuniya, Columbia University Press, Media Do, Symphony Space, Selected Shorts, Rita Wolf, Maria Dizia, Hugh Dancy, our interpreter, Mari Morimoto, and our guest of honor, Keiichiro Hirano.
Thank you.
Please join us upstairs in the lobby for a reception.